Okay. What an amazing stage. This is a huge stage actually. Välkomna hit, jag kan säga det på svenska också. Det är en stor scen detta som vi ska försöka fylla. We will try to fill this stage, do our best. And this whole seminar will be in English. But we will open up for a few questions in the end for about 10 minutes. And then if somebody is shy and want to pose your question in Swedish, we can help you translate into English. So you don't miss the opportunity to hear what the experts on stage has to say. And my name is Olga Persson. I'm the Secretary General for Unizone. We gather more than 130 women's shelters and young women's empowerment centers around Sweden. And I should try to facilitate and moderate this seminar, which is called How Can We Secure That Trans Inclusiveness Doesn't Lead to Eradicating Sex or Gender from the Work on Gender Equality. And before we will hear more about your investigation, Ulrika, I will just briefly introduce the panelists. And this is Klara Berglund. You're the Secretary General for the Swedish Women's Lobby. And we have Meghan Murphy, which you all have met, I think, during the opening sessions yesterday. And you're a journalist and researcher from Canada. And we have Helene Lundqvist Nymansson, and you're the head of the unit for gender and health at the Association of Local Authorities in Sweden. And Ulrika Westerlund, and you are the investigator of the inquiry concerning a stronger status and improved living conditions for trans people. And you're also the former chairperson for the LGBT organization RFSL. And we will start this seminar by hearing a summary of this investigation. Can you please hold it up for the audience? I think this is some kind of world record, isn't it? And it only took you 8 months. Okay. Yeah. And now you will have 15 minutes to briefly introduce the audience to the proposals, the most important proposals. And then the panel will discuss about the proposals, how it affects gender equality and how it can still be trans-inclusive without eradicating gender or sex. Thank you so much. And now I leave the floor to Klara to just briefly explain why this seminar is important at this conference.
Thank you. So this seminar comes from my brain. So I just wanted to explain to you what were our thoughts and what is the purpose of this talk. So in the women's movement, we have been fighting for so long for the oppression of women to be recognized and addressed. And this is what gender equality mainstreaming is about. To always have sex disaggregated goals and data and targets that will help us to see the unequal world that we live in and will help us to do the right actions to even out those inequalities. And in the Swedish Women's Lobby, we are trained watchdogs. You know, we are always looking out to see that there is sex disaggregated perspective. And that will help us see things such as the gender pay gap, such as men's violence against women, or, for example, boys' poor grades in school. And when we see these problems clearly, then we can do something about them. But in the last couple of years, we have noticed that governmental authorities, municipalities, and other public agencies are starting to go back to a gender-blind language. And this makes us really worried, because we thought that we had already won this struggle. The reason behind this development, we discovered, is the important work to make sure that transgender persons are included. And we have the highest respect for that struggle and to work against the discrimination and the hate and the violence against transgender persons. But at the same time, if this work leads to gender blindness, it would be a backlash to the work for gender equality and women's rights. So this is what we want to talk about today. And we want to have a sound and respectful and constructive talks about how we can move forward together. So that's the background. And now I'll give the floor to Ulrika.
Thank you very much. Is this on? Yes. Thank you very much for inviting me to this. I was invited to present some of the proposals from this investigation. So I have tried to, as you see, it's a very thick book, and the instructions to us as an investigation was extremely broad. So what you will see now is just a few examples. And I will end with the proposals that in some way relate to the gender equality work. But I have to say that most of the proposals don't really, because they are targeting the situation of trans people. But I just want to give you a brief kind of understanding of the context. But I understand that the topic of this discussion is mostly the proposals that touch on gender equality work. But just to give you like a little framing of what's in the investigation. So we have some results. That is the reason then for and some of the results on what we found about the situation for trans people in Sweden. This is based on results from a survey done by the European umbrella organization called Transgender Europe, and also the Swedish government agency Folkhälsomyndigheten. I don't remember the English name, but I think you understand. Almost a majority of trans people, or at least half, say that they can't live in accordance with their gender identity. And the results of this is that trans people also rate their health themselves as poorer than what the population as a whole does in similar inquiries. This also gets to suicidal thoughts and also attempted suicide, which is more common among trans people than among the population as a whole. In this survey done by Transgender Europe in Sweden, more than half of the people who responded to this said that they had had thoughts of attempting suicide during the past 12 months, and also 10% had actually tried to commit suicide within the past 12 months. So the situation is quite severe, and that was the reason for why this inquiry was done. There's also plenty of reports of experience of harassment, degrading treatment and discrimination, and also a feeling of being made invisible. For example then, some examples that come up is that the Swedish legal gender system does not permit another option than being legally male or female. And also one of the big topics for us was the dissatisfaction with the gender-affirming healthcare, könsbekräftande vård, like trans-specific healthcare that you access in order to, if you want to modify your body to better suit your gender identity. Very widespread dissatisfaction with that. This is just to give you some short understanding of some of the results in this. Now, some proposals that are trying to target some of these problems that we saw then. We want to see an agreement made with Helene's organization to try to make the access to the gender-affirming healthcare more equal across the country. Because it's very obvious that people mention problems that are very different depending on where you live. So waiting times can differ between 1 month to up to 18 months for access to particular cares that you need. And also following the recommendation from the National Board of Health and Welfare, Socialstyrelsen, also varies a lot in the country. So that should be addressed. We also got inspiration from the feminist work then in the gender equality area with how it's important to get knowledge while doing your training. So we actually took the exact formulation that was relating to that people who get specific trainings, for example, to become a doctor or a nurse, that you should have knowledge about men's violence against women. That's a great idea, we felt, but then also it should be possible to also include knowledge about the living conditions about LGBTQ people for the same trainings. So that wording is the exact same as the one that was put in as a suggestion in the work about men's violence against women. We also want to increase the skills in the police authority For example, when it comes with working with hate crimes, honor-related crimes, and violence in close relationships that affect also trans people. Also the Public Health Agency then, Folkhälsomyndigheten, they got a lot of tasks from us. For example, this one then, to have a better trans perspective in their work with suicide prevention that they already do, but it needs to have a stronger focus on the situation of trans people. We also try to look at the situation for particular groups of trans people, for example, asylum-seeking trans people. And this is one of our proposals, targeting asylum-seeking trans people, that the assessments made by the migration agency, the quality is poor. So it has to improve in order to ensure that the evaluation of those applications are the right one. As it is now, for example, then asylum-seeking trans women can easily be registered as men, which then leads to a number of problematic consequences in their asylum process. The last 3 slides then are more relating to gender equality work, as I could assess. We want, instead of a strategic plan that now exists to work on LGBT rights in Sweden, we wanted it to be more definitive and more clear, an action plan with a budget and goals that applies to all LGBTQI people. And we really liked the task of the new Gender Equality Agency because the task for that agency is almost exactly like the task that we would like to see also on the LGBTQI side of issues that need to be dealt with there. It's almost exactly the same as they are supposed to deal with when it comes to gender equality. And also then the situation for trans people also has to do with gender. So this seems like a perfect match for us. So our proposal was that they should also be responsible for coordinating the work for LGBTQI people in Sweden. SCB, Statistics Sweden, they already do some work. I don't know if you have maybe seen that, in order to how to produce material to assist public sector actors to include both binary and non-binary trans people in questionnaires and surveys. So they have tried to kind of deal with this problem that you were highlighting, Clara. How to make sure that we can see all differences in the population when we do surveys and questionnaires. I think the proposal that has gotten the most attention so far is this proposal from us to do another inquiry, this favorite proposal from state inquiries to do another one, this time to investigate the possibility to introduce a third legal gender in Sweden. And we think then in order to do that, you have to make the personal identity numbers gender neutral, but then you have to register gender in another way. Because otherwise it's not possible to introduce a third option. And we purposely did not put in take away legal gender for statistical reasons, but we want to introduce a third option for people who identify as non-binary. We also suggested to do another inquiry into reviewing the Children and Parents Code, Föräldrabalken, to make it gender neutral. This is a law in Sweden that it's like a little patchwork as it is now. Some parts of it are more than 100 years old and still in use, and others are much newer. And some of the problems with it became very apparent when this investigation who looked into surrogacy, but also other topics. They also looked into how to register trans people who are parents. And their suggestions included including new paragraphs in a very complicated way into this law in order to make it possible to register trans people. And we think that many of those problems that they encountered could be solved by making it gender neutral instead. And the last one on this slide, I think it's, no, semi-last slide. One problem that we saw was also that the medical record systems in Sweden, journaler, patientjournaler, they are very often gendered, which has led to problems for example, pregnant trans men with a male personal identity number, because then it has not been possible to use those programs to put in information about the development of the pregnancy and also during delivery and birth, which has created health risks for those people. So it should be possible to be pregnant and have a baby regardless of your personal identity number. We also think that the police could introduce the option X as a gender signifier on Swedish passports. And this can be done without introducing a third legal gender, because it is already possible in the international regulations around this. One of the latest countries who did this was Malta, in the southern parts of Europe. So this you can have regardless of your legal gender, if X is an option that suits you better with your gender expression or gender identity. We also want the Swedish Equality Ombudsman to look into how to make changing rooms and toilets more trans-inclusive. And also then we try to think about how to facilitate trans-inclusiveness and still have respect for that women don't maybe want to change clothes or use the same bathrooms as men all the time. So we try to see how it can be possible to be more inclusive and still not, and still kind of validate the experience of many women that I don't want to go into a public bathroom with many stalls if it's also men in there. So we looked into how to make it more inclusive and still be respectful of that experience. I think this was my last, yes. I'll stop there then and we can have a discussion about this. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. It's very much information in a very short time, but thank you so much. I will just get my phone so I keep track of the time because I don't see anything. So, okay, well, before we start the discussion, I just wanted to know, does the investigation have any reliable data on how many people we are talking about, and how many people are transgender in Sweden, and how many of them are non-binary? Does it say anything?
There is no such available data, but you can see that in, for example, when MUCF, the agency, MUCF, formerly known as Ungdomsstyrelsen, I don't remember the English name, I'm sorry. When they ask in surveys, about 1% of the people say that they don't want to identify as female or male, for example. And in this survey that Transgender Europe did, a quite high percentage, around 30%, if I remember correctly, said that the reason that I haven't changed my legal gender is because there is no option that suits me. And the people who identified as non-binary in the survey was almost half, slightly below than half, of the respondents in Sweden. But since when you do statistics on trans people, it's always quite complicated because you have to do particular surveys, for example, where you try to reach trans people exclusively, kind of that you spread these surveys online, for example. So that was done by Transgender Europe and also by the Swedish Folkhälsomyndigheten. They also did their survey in the same way. So the number of respondents from Folkhälsomyndigheten was about 800, and from Transgender Europe in Sweden it was 470 people.
Okay. Thank you. Maybe we can have, is this the first slide about the proposals? Are we
That's
back
the
to
third
last
one, I think. That's
so you can follow the discussion. I think we need to have yeah, let's start. This is the first one. Great. And this is about, you know, the special vulnerability. And I think maybe you could start, Meghan, you could start actually from Canada. How does this discussion is going on in Canada? Maybe we need some, you know, also in investigations, you always have this international, you know, you look what is going on around the world on this subject. And maybe you can give us a little background on the situation in Canada.
Sure, yeah. The The bill in Canada that's been proposed around gender identity legislation is Bill C-16. And I guess I want to start with the first problem with this conversation, and the foundation for this conversation is that we're conflating the terms sex and gender. So sex is about the body, sex is biological sex is male versus female. Gender is about the gender roles, so the stereotypes imposed on males and females. So when a baby is born female, immediately a socialization process starts, and she's socialized towards femininity, whereas boys that are born, so male babies, they are socialized into masculinity. So gender and sex are not the same thing. Gender is just an idea, sex is material reality. So I think that might be part of the problem that we're having when we get into talking about statistics, is that there's no real way to judge who identifies with what gender, because people don't identify with gender. Gender is something that's imposed. And under patriarchy, gender is imposed in a way that creates a hierarchy. So males are socialized into masculinity, which means dominance, and females are socialized into femininity, which means subordination. Patriarchy is also called male supremacy. So I think that in terms of resolving this issue of gender and who identifies with what gender and whether or not somebody identifies as non-binary, we're approaching this from a wrong and kind of incoherent angle, because there's no reason to get rid of sex. Sex is just something that exists. It's how we're born. What we do need to get rid of is gender and these stereotypes that are attached to men and women, also known as sexism.
But is this bill passed in Canada or?
Not yet. It's gone through 3 readings. It will pass. I don't know exactly when, but it will. And, you know, my issue with the bill again was that these terms, gender identity and gender expression, were defined in such vague and incoherent ways that it's troubling for us. It's troubling in terms of having this public discussion and creating legislation around these ideas that exist in opposition to feminist analysis of sex-based oppression and how gender functions under patriarchy, which is, from a feminist perspective, in a really harmful way.
But does this bill suggest a third legal gender?
No.
No. And that's not the proposal in this investigation either, but you propose for another investigation to investigate that.
Yes.
Yeah. So let's move on to Clara. What do you have to say? If we start with the other, did you change the?
Yes, but
yeah, because this is not very problematic, is it?
I think there are so many of your proposals that are so important, and then we have no problem at all, or critique. I think so much like the more education and better routines, and for example, trans persons that are refugees. Like, I think those suggestions are very important. It's just like as you also the ones that you put on the last slides that are about Thank you. Like, switch the channel. Yeah.
I will do my best.
Yeah. Thank you. So that's where we can see that this. I wish that we should have had this talk a long time ago, but I'm so glad that we're having it now, because we need to find a way forward, but we also need to see that this is not going to be without friction. And I think that going back to what Meghan was talking about is that we need to somehow, like, in a very respectful way, talk about the questions. What is sex? When is it decided? If we would have a third sex category, what requirements would it be to be in that category? And to do that in a respectful way, because if this is what all the gender equality work is built on, then we cannot question the basis for that work, It's very important to have like an intersectional perspective and always to see how this affects different groups of men and women. But here is a perspective that in some way challenges those sex categories. So we would have to talk about what practical implications would that have, but to do that in a sound and respectful way.
You will have the opportunity to discuss the practice on gender mainstreaming later, but Ulrika, you wanted to say something about...
No, I guess that we're going to talk about that, but then in your mind then, does having a third legal gender option, does that threaten in itself the gender equality work?
I think that's something that this inquiry that you have proposed really need to look into, because I think that if we just assume that we can add a third sex category and then we can continue the work that we do today using sex disaggregated data, goals and targets exactly the same way as we do today, where we have like half the population, then just including this smaller group, a minority. I think we have to really look into those implications. So that's what I wanted to say. It's not going to be without friction, and we have to be really careful because we cannot afford to have a backlash against gender equality work.
And can you see any of this friction maybe from the Association of Local Authorities in Sweden when on a policy level? I think it's very important also to divide between the policy level and the routines and the education and how you actually meet an individual, and that you need knowledge for that to be respectful towards another individual. But how can you see any difficulties or problems that the municipalities see when they try to be inclusive towards transgender people and try to work with gender equality?
Yes, of course we see some of these problems or challenges and questions that are put forward to us already today. But I would like to start also by saying that this is a government committee, which means that the government has asked Ulrika in this case to make proposals, to analyze the situation. So the government really acknowledges that this is a societal problem that we need to deal with, because it's not acceptable that we have groups of people in our country that feel very bad, that have bad health, and that really need help to prosper and to develop in our society. So therefore, it's important that we have this government committee. Unfortunately, I have not had the opportunity yet, since it came only 2 weeks ago or something, 3 weeks ago, to read the whole thing. It's 971 pages. So Ulrika has not been lazy at all, but I have studied the proposals. And the organization that I represent, the Swedish Association of Local and Regional Authorities, I think they're very much in focus of many of your proposals in here, which deals with how we meet, how the welfare institutions relate and meet people, and to, answer to their legitimate demands of having an equal healthcare system, etc., etc. Now, I want to say in democratic order that this has been now sent to our organization for circulation and for comments, and my organization has not yet. It will in due time deliver an answer, and therefore I'm not comfortable with answering or commenting on all the proposals, because that is at the end a political question. However, I can say by asking or answering your question, what we see already today, I think the main concern among our members, local and regional governments, is the question on statistics. And many of them ask us, how should we deal with this if we make surveys, etc., and we ask for people to sign their sex, if they're women or men. And local governments and regional governments, they want to be inclusive and they want to do well. So they ask us, how should we do this? Should we also, if people do not identify with being a woman or a man, how can we include them? And just yesterday, we've looked into this question or this issue, and just yesterday, I think, we posted a recommendation on our website where we said, and the experts at Salar, which is the name of our organization, they have looked into this, and they have come up or they have come to the conclusion that we cannot do any recommendation. So
We cannot do, sorry.
we cannot recommend anybody, in local and regional governments on how exactly to deal with this issue. We understand that you want to be inclusive, but you have to find your own ways in how you want to do it. And I know that you have some examples that you lift up from Gothenburg, how they have dealt with that issue. But what we say is that you also have to be very careful, because stating your sex, saying you're a man or a woman, is not something that is violating your integrity. Okay? That's not information that is sensitive in any way. But stating that you have another sexual identity or is transgender or whatever, that is, I would say, classified information, but it is considered to be personal information that you have to be very careful about how you gather and collect. Which is not the same thing to say that it's absolutely forbidden to collect it, but you have to be very careful on how you do it. And our experts came to the conclusion that the situation right now is a bit unclear when it comes to the legislation, what really is the, what's the limits here. And also we have to bear in mind that the GDPR legislation, which is a new legislation from the European Union, will start in May. The Dataskyddsförordningen will start now in May, and if you do it wrongly, you can risk of having very, very high fines. So we will this coming year also start discussions with Datainspektionen, which is an agency that deals with data protection, and see, what's the situation for the legislation. So that's one very concrete question that we get from our members right now.
Okay, which you are not helping them with, really.
Which we're not helping them with. Yes.
Sorry.
Yes. Yes. Well,
You made it a little bit more difficult. Okay, but so there's actually a recommendation to not gather statistic on transgender people. Am I correct?
That's not the recommendation, no. The recommendation is to, if you use other categories than man and woman, be careful that you don't violate or run the risk of violating anybody's integrity by gathering that kind of information. It's not forbidden, but you have to be careful. So that's our recommendation at this point. Okay.
Thank you. And Ulrika, you wanted to comment on that?
In this, one of the very good examples we thought we found came from the city of Gothenburg then, who had done a survey among their staff, as you refer to. And the interesting thing then is that you see, just as you know then on the gender equality, if you look at the differences between groups, then you also discover, if you do men and women, you see difference between the groups, and then you try to address the problems that you have found out about because you have asked questions about men and women. That's the point you're making, kind of. And that was also very much the point that when I worked within RFSL, we put a lot of effort into trying to make, for example, then Folkhälsomyndigheten and the Public Health Agency, to make them put in background questions in their big public health surveys about sexual orientation and gender identity, in order to see differences between groups in another way. Because then you can, for example, see that people who they then say, I identify as a lesbian woman, compared to heterosexual women, that group seems to have a bigger risk of drinking too much alcohol, for example. That was one thing that was visible from this investigation. And if you don't ask, you don't know. And then you can't try to address the problems that is obviously there. So I very much see the point of having statistics where you separate groups based on gender, like men and women, but I obviously also then want to see statistics where you also can separate out the population based on other grounds of discrimination, such as gender identity also. In this, we try to look at this, and we discover then that Statistics Sweden, they have already started a work where they try to address the same problem. And what they stressed was that it's a difference between if you take statistics that are based on registries, where you just take population registries and run it through a system, then you get legal gender. If you take those and try to combine them with asking other questions, then you can run the risk of that you were pointing out, that you can run the risk then of outing someone that is probably you're risking to maybe violate this new legislation that you have to pay attention to. But it's a difference if you do a survey where you don't have this registry-based statistic as a basis. If you just ask people, what is your gender identity? Male, female, non-binary, whatever you want to ask for options. That's a difference in asking that. Then you don't really run this problem of getting legal problems. And also then, what's very important to think about when you do surveys is, like, what is it that you want? What is it that you want to know? Is it differences between people with different legal genders? Is it differences between people with different gender identities? Is it something else? That must be the basis for what your question is and what you're thinking that I'm going to ask. There are very many bad examples. Like, very often people ask, how do you identify man, woman, trans person? Which doesn't make sense at all, because many trans people are men and women. So they are then, of course, going to check the box for man or woman. So then
Is that a problem?
Sorry?
Would that be a problem?
If you ask man, woman, trans person?
Yeah,
Yes,
and if they tick the box like I'm a man.
No,
Because
for
you identify
me
as
that's
men.
not a problem, because then they are men, obviously. But
Yeah.
then if your purpose with that, what is your purpose with that survey? Are you interested in finding out more about trans people? Then you also have to ask, do you have a trans background? Do you identify as a trans person, etc.? Some other question, in order to be able to see then results that specifically can be related to trans men or trans women, because they are going to check the boxes of women and men, obviously, if you ask them. How do you identify? Well, I'm a man. Many trans men are going to say. So then you won't find out anything more about trans people, if that's what you want with your survey. If not, then. But still asking men, are you a man, woman, or a trans person? That's obviously not going to work so well, because then it sounds like trans person is like a third category in itself, which it isn't.
Okay. So this third gender, legal gender, would not be like trans person. It would be something like non-binary or.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm not sure everybody understands. It's kind of difficult, so that's why I pose all the stupid questions, and you. Yeah.
Could I just comment on that? I think it's also a question, isn't it? It's also a question about the population that you post a survey to and the risk for our members. We talk about local government. They can have inhabitants of 6,000 people. If the population is very small, that you do the survey, the risk of revealing information that is higher. So if you have a national survey, then you have a much larger population to ask. So that's one aspect of it.
Okay, Clara, you wanted to say something.
Yes. If you don't mind, I will get back to gender equality.
Yeah.
So, not that this is not important, because it's really important to figure out those what it really means. But I thought that maybe that if we could have a concrete example of.
I wanted to hear the examples of the problems.
Yes. So if we could have a concrete example that I could share about when the transgender inclusiveness can lead to erasing sex and women's rights and gender equality. So in the Swedish women's lobby, we've worked a lot the last year with birth care and maternity care. And Ulrika brought that up too, how that it's important that you have gender neutral journals and journal in Swedish, but when you meet those parents. And when we've been working with this issue, we have been on the policy level and not in the level of the individual meeting with the patient or the parent and the child. So we have been on the policy level, and we have been so, frustrated and angry that this part of the healthcare system in Sweden is so badly handled. Like, there is such all about these alarms that we've had from different parts of the country, like women have to give birth in a taxi and they are shutting down the part of the hospital where you give birth, and they are doing all those things, and we have the persons working at that facility running between different women giving birth at the same time. And such a horrible situation, and we have been so frustrated about this, and for us it's so clear that this is about women's rights and gender equality. It's about the women working in those facilities. The persons working there, they are mainly women. The persons that are receiving this care, they are women, mainly. And that's why this care has such low priority. If men would have given birth, it would have been a completely different story. And for us, that's like the most important analysis, and we will never have a better care if we don't have that with us when we work with these issues. But at the same time, I can see that in the meeting with the patient, you have to have that gender-neutral approach. So we can be on these different levels at the same time. But when people come to us, which many people have done, and told us that you should never say women giving birth, you should say persons giving birth. For me, I'm so frustrated by that, because for me it's so evident that if we do that, we erase patriarchy, we erase gender, the oppression of women. All of that is gone and we can never move forward. So I thought that was maybe an example.
Thank you, Clara. We have just five more minutes. I'm sorry, I lost track of time because everything was so interesting. But I think we have to open for the audience to ask, is there a program directly after this?
So this ends at 14:15.
Yeah, good. We have 50 minutes.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry, I thought we were going to end at 3. Okay. Do you want to say something about that? Because now we're in the middle of what the seminar should be about. How can you be trans-inclusive, not eradicating gender or sex, and still working with gender equality and women's rights?
Yes. I can't speak on behalf of all trans activists in Sweden or LGBTQ activists in Sweden either, but I have never met anyone who has tried to deny that the problems within certain parts of the healthcare system is probably because it's a healthcare that targets women mostly. So that analysis there, people can definitely shake hand, and then we discuss how to make it. I can give another example then. I'm extremely involved in the endometriosis care because I have endometriosis, and there it has been enormous focus on this. How can we both try to make sure that we understand that this has been a low priority, probably because it targets people who mostly identify as women, but also how can we not deter other people who also have wombs, who also have endometriosis that don't identify as women, so that they are not feel excluded from all these support groups that exist on Facebook, for example. So many of those support groups have worked a lot with kind of how to address everyone affected by this so that everybody can access information and knowledge about how this care can be provided to you in the best possible way. So it's the same discussion where you kind of try to keep in mind this is a gendered problem that has to do with power hierarchies and patriarchy and all that, but still be respectful of that all people who give birth are not women, and all people who have endometriosis are not women either. So I think these two perspectives have to exist at the same time in order to kind of address the structural problems, but also be inclusive and pragmatic.
Have that discussion been successful? Has it?
Yes.
Has it put the illness on the agenda in a different way, or if you should have framed it just as a women's issue or about women's rights?
From my perspective, it has been successful because I know then many more people who are involved in these support groups and organizations who want to be part of the endometriosis association because now they have tried to be more inclusive of the language that they use, for example. This is a support organization for everyone who has this illness. Regardless of how you identify. So,
because I have an example from my point of view, working with violence, men's violence against women, and where we have this shift of in terminology, which I think you all know about in the municipalities, where you go from talking about men's violence against women to violence in close relationships. And our criticism against that has been that you making the perpetrator invisible, and you forget who is the perpetrator and who is mostly the victim. It's a male perpetrator and a female victim, and that has been very important to put the issue on the agenda and also to make men accountable for the violence. And when you erase the word men and the word women, you're making the perpetrator invisible, and that's very problematic for our work. And on a policy level, at least see a few examples in the municipalities, and you gave one when it comes to the maternity care, and Helen, you wanted to say something about that.
Well, I think it's important to bear in mind, and I do think that you do, Ulrika, it's important to bear in mind the history that we come from. I mean, also the struggle that has been, the struggle that the women's movement, but also in Sweden, the women politicians over party lines, all the efforts that have been put in to really push for the agenda for gender equality between women and men in our country. I think that it would be, I think we need to talk to each other, right? From different perspectives on how we can develop our society. But I think it's important to bear in mind that, as you were saying, we struggle for a very, very long time to name the perpetrator, to not talk about, when it comes to violence against women, to not talk about, because the normal thing would be to talk about domestic violence, or apartment violence was something that the police used to use as a term, like if the sofa and the kitchen table would fight with each other, right? There's actually a man and a woman who lives there, and the woman is, constantly and systematically suppressed and abused and exposed to violence. Anyway, so that was important for the gender equality policy to really name what it is about. And I agree with you that very, very quickly you started replacing the expression men's violence against women with another expression saying violence in close relationships, which is not the same thing, because men's violence against women can be in close relationships, but it can also be with somebody that you don't know, that you abuse out in town or something. So I think it's important to take account of the things that have been important, and I think gender statistics or statistics disaggregated by sex have been an important tool to show the differences between women and men. And I think that it would be strategically bad for also LGBT people, or the situation for trans people or LGBT people, if we would make the conditions for working with gender equality less good. You see what I'm saying? I mean, if you would make it harder to work with gender equality issues, I don't think that group will gain from that either. And so I think that we carefully need to think, and that's what politics is about, right? To make considerations, to consider the implications and the consequences in different situations, so that you don't, shoot your own foot, trying to reach one target and then maybe, do something that is not good in another aspect. So you carefully need to think of what the changes will mean. Yes.
Yeah. And Meghan, you wanted to add something.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting that we're talking about sex in terms of the medical system and healthcare, because, of course, males and females have different bodies and therefore require different kinds of healthcare. And there's actually a history of things like drugs and medications being tested only on males, which can be really harmful for females and, cause women to have more heart attacks or not be able to be treated for heart attacks and things like that. There's absolutely no reason why we need to have gender neutrality in terms of the healthcare system, and in fact that would be a really scary and dangerous thing to do. The only people in the world who give birth are females, so we can talk about birth and pregnancy in terms of women. We don't need to make that gender neutral. And considering that patriarchy exists specifically in order to control women's reproductive capacity, erasing sex from conversations either about sex-based discrimination, sexism, or in terms of birth and the ability to become pregnant and the harms that has caused under patriarchy for women in terms of, not being able to get certain jobs or losing their jobs or not getting promotions because there's this assumption that women might become pregnant. you know, these are all really, really important things to talk about when we're talking about gender equality. And this concept of gender neutrality, I think, is totally unnecessary and misguided, and it doesn't make any sense. There's no reason why somebody can't say I'm male or female. The vast majority of people in this world are male or female unless they have an intersex condition. There's nothing wrong with that. You know, it's just our bodies, it's just how we're born. So.
You would like to comment on that, Ulrika, and then we will let the audience in, so it's a short comment.
Yeah, I think if we go into this discussion, it's going to be a very completely different discussion also. But then, for the record, then I have to say that trans men and non-binary people also give birth, kind of. But that doesn't... That does not mean erasing gender or starting to use at all times a gender-neutral language to try to eradicate differences in power between men and women. So I think the important thing is, I think that from my perspective then, the trans movement, the LGBT movement, has spent lots of energy on how can we work for trans equality and not harm gender equality for cis men and cis women and everyone else affected. And I like this talk. It's like I see it as then it's trying to be solution oriented, kind of how can we move forward together and how can everybody start looking into solutions to this problem that is our joint problem, where like nobody wants to make birth healthcare or women's healthcare or healthcare for people with certain body parts worse. Like people want to make it better, of course. So it's kind of then, what is it then? Which exact proposals from the trans movement or this investigation is making it harder to work on gender equality topics? What are those? And then bring those up, and then let's see, can we solve it together then? How can we do this, both on a local and regional level and more on a more structural, national level? So.
How we can avoid gender neutrality, I would say then, so we don't make the oppression of women invisible in statistics and so on, and you share that view.
Exactly,
That's
but then
important,
it's like words are important, but also then this, that's why, for example, then RFSL and many other organizations often use like men's violence against women and other violence in close relationships or honor-related violence. So you try to be kind of, we define violence, but then also do not eradicate violence, because it's important that all victims get the attention and support that they deserve, and not just people who are victims of men's violence against women.
Do you want to say the audience? A very short then.
This will be very short. No, I just want to say that that's exactly the type of conversation we want to have. But also, I just want to object when you say that no one wants to make the situation worse for women and girls, because I think that's not true. And I think that there is a big risk that patriarchy and forces that are against women's rights will use this as leverage. So I think we have to recognize that this is the perfect excuse. I'm not saying it's always like that, but I'm just saying that it can happen, that someone can say this is a perfect excuse to hide the oppression of women, and people will use that.
Of course, somebody wants to, but I don't think that it's not the trans activists that are your enemies. So, it's the.
Thank you. Now, do we have a brave person from the audience? Or you don't have to be very brave, but I can't see you really, so you have to like raise your arm very high. There you go. And we have a microphone, so you wait till you get a microphone. And if you want to introduce yourself, that would be very nice.
Yes, hello. My name is Kurt, and I come from the Norwegian Ministry of Gender Equality. And I think this discussion is very important. I do have to challenge, though, all of you, and especially the Mrs. Berglund, if I may, because a couple of years ago we got a gender-neutral military service law in Norway, saying or stating that both men and women were allowed and should serve for military. And when the new law was passed, we had a big job eradicating all references to the sex man, because that was how military personnel was described earlier, of course, because it was only men who were entitled to serve in the military service. And now it's gender neutral. When we refer to military persons, they're always in a neutral way, so they can be both men and women, and also transgendered people. I really see your point, Berglund, but then do you have any concrete solutions of how this should be made then from the authorities that will make, or that we could include both perspectives? Because right now I don't see any solutions, because we are trying to make old-fashioned laws modern so that they can include both men and women, and also non-gender specific persons. And it's hard. It's a big challenge, so we need all the help we can get. Thank you.
Maybe, and this is a very good question and a good example on how gender neutrality can open up a male space for women. But how could you deal with this problem without gender neutrality? And how can you, if I can add something to your question, how can you see how the situation for women within the military now, how can you make maybe the situation for women visible if you have this gender neutrality approach? Do you have statistics on that, and how can you would like to comment on that, Clara?
Yes,
because this is a good example on how municipalities and state agencies are doing this. You want to be inclusive, you make it gender neutral.
Yeah. So I wanted to say actually exactly what you said, Olga. But
I'm sorry.
So I think, first of all, that's like a completely different thing to talk about. That's like, changing this male-dominated space, changing it into welcoming women. That's one thing. But what I mean is that when those women have entered and been welcomed into the military, how do we make sure that they have the same pay, that they feel as good and are as healthy? How would we make sure that they have the same access to different services and supports and things that are within the military? So in order to do that, we have to avoid being gender neutral. And avoiding this neutrality means having sex disaggregated data, sex disaggregated goals, and targets, and to follow them up regularly. So that's something completely different, I think.
Okay, thank you. We have many more questions, and I think we can have one more. It's a short one. I don't know if you were the people with the mic. Where are you? Here is one question, and I don't know if it was any other one before you, but otherwise we take you.
Hello, I'm
I don't
Lucas.
see anything, that's why.
I'm Lucas, and I want to say that I'm actually a man, and I gave birth to a baby. So I'm sorry, but I do exist. And in Swedish I will say, det är jättetrevligt att svensk kvinnolobby tycker att man gärna vill föra en diskussion om frågorna. Men eftersom jag håller på med transfrågor i typ 18-20 år, så måste jag säga att jag har i alla fall inte hört av svensk kvinnolobby tidigare, utan istället så gör man det här till en programpunkt på en konferens där nästan inga av oss kan vara, eftersom det kostar en hel del pengar, och där är ingen transperson inbjuden till panelen. Så hur gärna vill ni egentligen föra de här samtalen på en respektfull grund?
You want to answer?
Yes, so thank you for the question. So this is our first, shaky steps to have this discussion. And it's really important for us to have the discussion on a policy level, and not for this discussion to be about individual experiences, no matter how important they are. So what this panel is about and what this conference is about is gender equality mainstreaming. What we want to do is just to look at these proposals and see from a gender equality mainstreaming experts that we are, how do we analyze this proposal? So that was our purpose. And then we would be happy to continue this. And also, as you said about the conference, so this is the conference, and there is a professional conference for people working in this field. And the conference pays for itself. So we have to we have to have a fee to have this conference, and we think it's really important that this is gender equality is such an important field that it can support itself. So that's the background to the conference, and that's the topic for this panel. So, but also we would be happy to invite it to you to have this conversation, because we haven't been that either. Thank you.
So, and that will be the final words, and hopefully we will continue this discussion, because it's very important and we have a lot of challenges ahead of us, and we want to be trans inclusive and we want gender equality. So thank you to the panelists and thank you to the audience, and we could have go on for days and hopefully we will. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Do I have any presents for you? No? For the panelists. So.